Hey everyone, welcome back to Questing Beast. Today we are doing a live show just for my patrons, in case you're someone watching this at some point in the future. So this is where I hang out with some of my upper tier patrons. I do some mapping, we just hang out for an hour or so, and chat with people. People can ask me questions, just shoot the breeze or whatever. So I'm going to do some mapping today. So if you're watching this in the future, I'm just going to be drawing maps for an hour or so. That's not your thing. That's totally fine. I'm just be sort of exploring here and seeing what I come up with. I'm really thinking I'm going to be doing a larger map, maybe like a big continent, maybe several continents. It's a bit tricky to do that on a smaller piece of paper, but let's see here. First of all, there's anyone listening in the chat right now. Is this video flipped backwards? Like, is this 20 backwards? It looks like it's backwards on my screen, but I don't think it is on YouTube. One of the ones I recorded before was backwards, and I don't want that to happen again. Anyway, let's use a bigger pen, because I like to do bigger pens for the coastline. It's been a little while since I did a map, so kind of see where this goes. Thinking about a couple continents that are close together with some big islands. I really like that sort of setup for a world map because it allows you to have oceans that you can cross and provide like these big barriers. But also you got a lot of interesting land masses close enough that you're going to have empires that are warring across the ocean, and crossing from one continent to another isn't too arduous. So players might actually want to do it. Hey, Sam. Hey, Lord Walrus. How you guys doing? Thanks for hanging out. Let's see here. Let's do some big islands in the middle first. A cool thing that I was thinking about recently in terms of doing these maps or doing coastlines, because I struggle a lot with coastlines sometimes, is there's this amazing Twitter bot, Uncharted Atlas, I think, that just spits out random maps. And it's actually pretty good because I think it procedurally generates them using actual terrain, and then it like raises and lowers the water level and figures out where the mountains are and stuff like that. So it actually looks fairly realistic topographically, but it's all randomly generated just by an algorithm. So I was actually thinking that at some point, if you really get stuck drawing a coastline that just doesn't look right for one reason or another, you can kind of steal bits and pieces of the coastline from that random generator, because some of them actually look really good. They tend to be very jagged, very like fjord-like, but I'm really into islands that look like that. So this island's looking pretty good, pretty crazy. With really jagged coastlines like this, you're really probably thinking that it's going to have a lot of fjords, I guess, big pieces of land being sliced out by glaciers as they are rolling down to the sea. And one way that you can create a sense of scale. So this is really important when you're creating like big continent maps, because a lot of times it's really hard for people to tell how big your land masses are unless you have a lot of detail. So making your coastlines have a lot more detail, have a lot more wiggle to them, tends to make it look like it's more detailed, which makes you think that you're farther away. Because when you're zoomed in really close, things are more smoothed out. But the farther away you get all of that really detailed texture along long coastlines. So that can be one trick. So if I have a big island here, I want to have some other ones nearby. So maybe one that goes along up here. So what are you guys up to in the RPGosphere. Got any campaigns going? And if so, how are they going? I just started a campaign pretty recently doing some 5th edition, which I normally don't do, right? Because I'm really into OSR stuff. But I figured it was worth knowing how to run 5th edition. And I mostly run for kids, right? For 5th graders. And so I figured it might actually be good for them to get exposed to what mainstream D&D looks like. Because if they, play with other people, then chances are people are going to want to play 5th edition. So I actually got started doing that, and I'm doing something I haven't done before, which is like a giant hex crawl. And I'm using the ones from, what's that website? Save versus Total Party Kill, I think it is, where it has a bunch of these gigantic hex maps with like a good 400 hexes, each of which has been crowdsourced from the G+ community. And there's one that's just like all ice, and there's one that's all desert themed. And so it's so huge, and it's fairly detailed. At least there's 1 or 2 really interesting stuff in every single hex, which means that you can basically just run it as is, which is what I'm trying to do. So I have the kids just like roll 2d20s and just use that as a cross reference to figure out where on the map they start out. And then I just turn to that hex and I read what's there, and then I just improv from there. And the kids are really liking it so far. I've never tried to do like a full-on hex crawl before, so it's great to have something where it's really all worked out already. And there's a lot of really great content that I wouldn't have thought of. No games for the next couple months. That sucks, man. It can be really tough to find like a adult in-person group. Like I had one for a while, but I have mostly kids groups now, which is fun. But it's not the same as having an adult group, especially since I don't get to play much anymore because I just don't have like a GM. Still looking for one. Phoenix seems a little poor in terms of good groups. Certainly in terms of OSR groups, I haven't seen a lot of that. All right, we have this sort of big bay going on here. I'm wondering whether I should just double down on it or just close it off. I think I need some islands. I think that'd be cool. Because the more islands and things like that you put in areas like this, the more likely people are to explore them. So it's all about adding density of features where there's a reason to go to any given place on your map, right? Any place on your map that are just really boring and don't have a lot of features are basically going to be unused space. Players will kind of instinctively avoid them. So a lot of places that look like they could have interesting things is always good. So let's have this map sort of continue on down in this direction. It's been a bit of a while since I made a bunch of videos, though I have a couple new reviews in the pipeline. The one I'm excited the most about actually is Sharp Swords and Sinister Spells, which I got a review copy of. And it has a lot of like black hack influences in terms of that it's all like roll under, but it's much less trad in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of, doesn't have like the 6 basic stats. For example, it has like 4 stats. And it's been rationalized in a way that I think that makes a lot more sense versus the black hack. It's closer to what I would like to play. The black hack is a little too simple for me. There's not a whole lot of customization. Whereas Sharp Swords and Sinister Spells bakes in some stuff that you might see in White Hack, for example, where you can have custom or player created backgrounds that work like skill packages. And I really like stuff like that. in general, I've been really interested in roll under systems recently, because there's a lot of those systems that have been coming out recently. Stuff like Sharp Swords and Sinister Spells. There's White Hack, Black Hack, Mage Blade by Palo Greco. That's an interesting one. Simbarum. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. The Swedish one with like the giant ancient forest. That has a really interesting roll under system that I really like. I think it's mostly cluttered by the fact that it has too many stats. It has like 8 stats, and it kind of expects all of your monsters to have 8 stats as well, which is just too much for me. I don't like to keep track of that much in terms of monsters. But the basic idea behind that system is really cool. And the way that roll under systems allow you to resolve things really quickly, because the players immediately know what they have to roll. They don't have to say, can I make a roll, and then ask the GM, like, what's my target number, and then roll to see if it works. They automatically know what it is, and you can modify it if you need to. Like if it's extra dangerous, you can just, modify what their target number is. But there's a default one, and they just roll it. I think that's really nice and fast. It's also much easier to teach, which is something I've been thinking about a lot. Because I have to teach a lot of kids how to play D&D, and it takes a long time. It really does. Even 5th edition, which is fairly straightforward compared to other stuff, is just, there's just a lot of stuff in there that you feel like you have to teach. And when you have roll under, it's just like, see that number in your sheet, roll that or less. That's really great. And let's sort of slope it out this way. That's pretty cool. But I don't want this to be all ocean. Maybe, okay, it needs some more islands off in this direction, because you don't want people to just stop here. You want them to press further onward into the ocean, looking for stuff. I love doing sea maps with lots of islands and stuff. Archipelagos are a huge thing for me. There's not enough sea crawls out there. Although there's a couple cool ones being written, actually. Like, what are some of those? Weird on the Waves by Kyle Chenier is going to come out pretty soon, or it might already be out. And that looks really neat. That's like a Lamentations of the Flame Princess wave crawl. And then there's also the Driftwood Verses, which is for Lamentations as well. And that's going to make this really thick, like detailed hex crawl with like new classes and tons of encounters and dungeons and stuff. I actually kickstarted that a while ago, and I'm really excited for it, because it's just sort of one of those genres that isn't explored all that much, especially in more trad D&D. And because there's something innately D&D and like hex crawly or like open world about it, because you have like an open ocean where there's not a whole lot. There can be, sea encounters, but you have islands which immediately look like points of interest. So you immediately want to go to them and explore them, which means journeying across the ocean. And it stops you from having to fill everything with detail, because you can just fill in like all of the islands with really interesting encounters. Then players can just kind of go to them as they choose. It seems like a really easy way to do a big sandbox. That's pretty cool. All right, so more islands out this way. Archipelagos have really been on my mind recently since Ursula Le Guin died, which happened like last week. That hit me pretty hard. She's an amazing fantasy author. She wrote A Wizard of Earthsea and the rest of the Earthsea books. And that first original trilogy, at least, was like a huge influence on me. And I go back and I reread it periodically. One of the best fantasy novels ever written, one of the best fantasy worlds. And it's all just like one big archipelago with a great characterization. She does a lot with very little. Her books, at least the Earthsea books, are not very long. They're like 200 pages, but she does an amazing job at just implying this incredibly detailed world by just dropping statements about things that are true about the world and the way that people look at things. And you just flesh out so much in your head. It's so great. I mean, in contrast to stuff like Brandon Sanderson stuff, which I know is really popular, But I just can't get into stuff like that because it is so detailed. It really piles the detail on you. And I feel like it doesn't trust you to believe in the world. And so it feels like it has to kind of make you by just giving you more and more stuff about, you know, what everyone's names is and what all the houses are and what all the details down to such a minute level that your imagination kind of isn't really working anymore. Too much detail can really kill the imagination when it comes to these things. So we kind of got an island chain going here. So I assume that there's like a mountain range sort of underwater going off in this direction. Don't want to keep it too consistent. Have stuff that's just like kind of breaks with the pattern a little bit. A big island out here. Sort of figure out the general shape of the island in my head, and then you kind of do variants on it, or you kind of follow that line a little bit, but not too closely, so that it breaks up and sort of takes on shapes that you weren't really expecting. There we go. I'm also on Twitter, actually, which was something that I hadn't done in a long time. Like, I got a Twitter account a long time ago. Never really used it. And then I realized that there was a lot of really interesting D&D people on there. So I'm tweeting now and then at Benjamilt. But you could probably find me if you look up Questing Beast. All right, let's have another continent over here. Yeah, let's have it sort of not, let's have it fairly close to this archipelago. Maybe there's sort of a, give it some space here. Another trick that I use occasionally is I don't draw one coastline all at once. I just draw little bits and pieces of it in different places, and then I kind of work out how they're connected. I think that forces me to be, it gets me out of my groove. Because if I'm just drawing one line all the way through, then I don't think it looks as realistic. Whereas if I have lots of little lines and need to sort of figure out how they're connected, then I end up with unusual shapes. A lot of it is just trying to break the human impulse to make things look, you know, right. Because a lot of times the coastlines of countries will look really strange, right? And they look really unexpected. And that's hard to do if you're just working by yourself. I like having these little like pointy bits going in because those are good places where you can have for rivers to drain out of, right? They can be like a little delta. But you can sort of figure that out and fill it in later. Let's see. Okay, so this is pretty neat. So we have sort of like a sea over here. So you want to have a lot of, you want to be thinking about positive and negative space the whole time. So what the land masses look like, but also what the sea masses look like, if you want to think of it that way. So sea should be interestingly shaped and have a lot of possibility to them, right? So like we have like a sea right here, but you can see that it's broken into like a smaller area over here and one over here. That's really good because you can give them individual names and people will likely treat them differently because, you know, they look like their own thing. So you might have like a pirate armada that mostly patrols over here, but is trying to push its way over here. Whereas like someone's trying to control this straight over here and so on. Whereas if it's all just like one undifferentiated mass, then you're not going to have those conflicts going on there. Okay, that's kind of neat. And then let's sort of wrap it up in this direction. You know what? Let's have this continent kind of go up here so that this whole area is like one long strait in between these two continents. And there's all these big islands in the middle that are being fought over and that need to be circumvented if you're going to like trade between the countries, because that automatically has is ripe for conflict. It implies things about the world that you can leverage. And this one is like really jagged, so I'm gonna have a little bit of this, but I want this one to be a little bit smoother to give it a different, distinct character. Because if all your coastlines look exactly the same, things look a bit samey. So you want to try and find ways to vary it up a little bit. And smoother coastlines will imply beaches and things like that, whereas more jagged ones will imply actual mountain ranges and rocks and things like that. Okay, there we go. I really like that. I'm a fan. Let's work on the high ground. Now that I've figured out where the coastlines are, I put in some mountains and hills. And the reason I want to do that is because a lot of stuff follows from that. Mountains and hills will tell you where a lot of your water sources are going to start from, because a lot of rivers start in mountain ranges and in higher ground and flow to lower ground. So figuring that out is kind of important. And also it's going to affect things like climate, because things like clouds and winds are going to be pushed around and deflected by mountain ranges. So that's going to determine where you might have cold areas and warm areas, where you're going to have forests and things like that. So it ends up determining a lot of things. And it's also going to determine a lot of natural borders, right? Rivers end up being political borders pretty frequently, but mountain ranges and hills end up being just natural borders. Your kingdom can't expand in that direction because there's a mountain range in the way. So setting that stuff up is important because it determines a lot of things right away. Using a 5 for this. Let's go down to a slightly smaller pen. Let's go with this one. So you guys in the chat, have you been reading any RPG books recently that you particularly enjoy? I'm on the lookout for other books to review, especially stuff in the OSR. But you know what? I'm not that picky. I'll read pretty much anything. Although stuff that's OSR flavored, that's more, open and sandboxy, tends to be more interesting to me. I'm also on the lookout for new fantasy novels and just stuff to read in general, because I've been running dry on that. It's been harder for me to get into books. I don't really know if that's because it's like the 21st century and I am just like drowned in digital notifications and my attention span is shrinking, which I sure hope it isn't, but I mean, that could be it. Or if it's just because I have a really hard time finding the sort of books that I grew up on and that I really enjoyed when I grew up. Stuff like A Wizard of Earthsea, or Lord of the Rings, or, the Once and Future King, stuff like that. So fantasy worlds that aren't really big on, what's the best way to say it? Like when I was talking about Brandon Sanderson, his stuff feels clever and very constructed in a way that a lot of my favorite novels don't. So for example, he'll put so much work into world building and especially into magic systems, right? He's hugely into magic systems. I think he's done whole seminars on how to create a magic system. And it's clear that he's setting up all of this stuff because he thinks that you can drive a plot out of it, right? When you have a good magic system set up that has good costs for like what it costs to use it and is very limited in how it works, then you can draw drama out of it. It's a lot like designing a game, actually, in a lot of ways, which is kind of interesting. Setting up political tensions and characters that want different things and magic systems that cost stuff, and then you sort of watch a plot evolve out of it. Whereas a lot of classic fantasy, of course, is not about that sort of thing at all. The whole gaming mentality of creating a lot of tension and unbalanced situations that are going to collapse into interesting things. That's how you set up a good world in gaming. But in fantasy, like literature, the really good ones, it's about, character development, and the world is almost secondary. The world is often beautiful and immersive, but it's a backdrop for what the characters are going through. And I feel like world building takes such a forefront in a lot of modern fantasy that the actual immersion in the story and the characters gets left out. That's been my experience anyway. Sam says, I don't think I've read anything that you haven't reviewed already. Yeah, I review a lot of stuff. I need to get back to that, start chewing through more of my backlog. Ford Wallace, I read the entirety of Blood in the Chocolate. It's so well laid out. Yeah, I actually got a copy of Blood in the Chocolate recently, and I've been sort of flipping through it. And I really do like the way it's laid out. I appreciate how Kyle is thinking about that and trying to put that at the forefront, right? Any book that actually is written by a dungeon master, wait, that's a kind of a weird thing to say, because I assume that most people who write D&D inventors are dungeon masters. But the way they design the books, you wouldn't know that a lot of the time. Because you'd think that they would set it up in such a way that you could get the information you needed right when you needed it. But that is so often not the case. It blows my mind. I don't know. Maybe I'm too spoiled by the OSR at this point. All right, let's get some mountains going here. I like having a lot of mountains just because it breaks things up in interesting ways. Let's start with a pencil, actually. Let's sort of figure out roughly where we want them to go. Down here. There's mountains going off that way. I want this area to be fairly open with maybe some like patches of mountains and hills in the middle. Whereas this area can have lots of hills and mountains. I'm thinking of it kind of like Greece. So let's start off like with that. I'm really kind of tending more towards just doing the sloped or inverted V's, which is probably the easiest way of doing mountains. But once you add a bit of texture to them, it looks really good, and they're just really easy to do. And you can also make ranges going in more than one direction. Because doing the whole ridge technique where you do the slopes looks really great for mountain ranges that are going roughly downwards. But if you have like a big patch of mountains that are going multiple directions, that's a lot harder to do. You have to plan things out much more carefully. Get rid of some of this. Let's see. Chat says, I read Blood in the Chocolate a few weeks ago using maze rats. Oh, awesome, man. How did that go? I'm curious to see how like the random magic and stuff would combine with the crazy candy and so on. Because all those crazy candy effects that you can get in Blood in the Chocolate look like they're so much fun, and that they would just cause such havoc. You want to add mountains of different sizes, and you want to make it fairly dense. You don't want to have it really like have a lot of open spaces in there, because you really want to show how impassable that area is. Just having them kind of overlap a little bit. All right, that's pretty good. And then let's have some sort of mountains in the middle here. So that's not just one big plain. It's sort of broken up naturally into like some small regions. At least people would think of it that way. Let's see. Because you want to think about the way that the people living here would conceive of these areas. Even if there isn't like a natural border between two areas, if it feels like a coherent area that's sort of set apart from another place, just because it looks that way, then the people living there will tend to think of it that way, and they'll name it something different, and then that'll just sort of take on a life of its own. It's pretty crazy. Lots of PC deaths. Yeah. That adventure looks pretty deadly. I love the fact that it has, what was it, a pygmy tracker at the back. So there's tons of these little Oompa Loompas, basically, but they've been rethemed in Blood and the Chocolate, which, if anyone watching this doesn't know, is basically a retheming of Willy Wonka, the Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory, into D&D. And it has tons of these like pygmy creatures that are just trying to kill you. And so what the back of the book does is it has like a page full of tons of little pictures of pygmies, and you just cross them off as they die. So you can actually track really easily in real time how many of them are left. So in theory, you could chew through all of them, but I mean, probably they'll just swarm you and kill you. Get a few more mountains over here. That way you can have like a pass going through here. That's always cool. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Let's get some mountains going down in this direction. We ended up burning the place to the ground. Yeah, I mean, after, what was the mission supposed to be? You're going in there to get like a chocolate recipe from this Contessa or whoever, who has gotten the recipe for chocolate like 100 years before it historically was discovered. And after all the horrors that you see in there, yeah, I'd be burning it to the ground too. Industrial sabotage. And see, if we have a mountain range going down this way, that's going to cut off this coast kind of from the rest of it, which is nice, I think. Well, let me see. I want this area to be kind of distinct. So maybe have some mountains going down in this direction. Connect these up a little bit. Maybe I don't want it to be totally cut off. Because they can still go around that way, of course. Maybe we can have like a pass through here. There's not a lot of mountains there, so in theory, people could get through. And then, yeah, leave it kind of open here on the bottom. Because you got to think about trade routes and how movement is going to work, and if you have PCs wandering around, how they're going to deal with the different obstacles, right? Because you want it to be possible to get from anywhere to anywhere, by and large, but you should want there to be interesting complications along the way. So going from one place to another shouldn't be too straightforward ever, right? All right, or at least going direct routes. There should be ways to get a safe route from here to there, as long as you're willing to circumvent a lot of stuff. So if they're willing to pay in terms of resources and time, then they can get there safely. But if they want to get there directly, you want to have plenty of events and obstacles that they have to go through. That makes for interesting choices. Let's see. I'm working on a play test of something else. I know that last time I was talking about a game where it was just a lot of, you didn't have one PC, you had lots of very simple PCs. And that's something that's still kicking around in the back of my head. I'm not quite sure how to do it yet. A lot of times it's waiting for the right inspiration to strike. But in terms of a more standard role-playing game, I have another prototype kind of kicking around that is a lot inspired by those roll-under systems I was talking about. Sort of taking the best from all of them. Though you know what one of the best one is the GLOG, the Goblin Rules of Gaming that Arnold Kemp came up with. And then Skirples from Coins and Scrolls has really been expanding on. That is a amazing system. It does roll under really, really well, and its magic system is one of the best. It also has a ridiculous amount of content. Even though there's only like 3 or 4 people really making content for it, there's just hundreds of spells and just items and potions and classes. It's really, really cool. Especially the way that all the classes feel really distinct, because I like customizing my character. The idea of feats doesn't really put me off. I like having some mechanically unique things that I can combine to make an interesting character. But I'm not a huge fan of the way that standard leveling sort of takes you along one track, and there isn't a lot of choices along that track. And to get off it, you have to multi-class, which is complicated and kind of weird. The way that the Glog does it is that there's lots of classes, and each of them has like 4 tiers, which you can get at levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they each have really distinct, like flavorful abilities, a lot of which aren't like mechanical bonuses, but are just really cool stuff. Like there's one for the Assassin where it has an ability at I think if you get like the 4th tier of its abilities, you can just disappear as long as you could plausibly disappear. And then any point in the future, if you're in an area with like a bunch of NPCs, then you can say that you were that NPC this whole time, rip off your mask and rejoin the scene. So you can actually like disappear into a crowd and disappear so completely that even you, the player, don't know where you are. And then you can pop back into the scene at an opportune moment. That is so cool. It's, I guess, kind of story gamey, but you would feel like such a badass. You'd feel like a total assassin if you could do stuff like that. So that's the sort of stuff I like. And the Glog does it really well. And the way it's set up is that every time that you level, you can just choose a tier from one of this huge multitude of classes. So multi-classing is super, super easy because it's just like a couple abilities that you just tack onto your character. And that's all you have to do. But if you stick with one of these classes for long periods of time, you get the really good stuff. But you don't have to. It's easy to mix and match, which is a big deal for me. So what was I saying? Oh yeah, so like that's been a big inspiration for me. So I'm working on a game where that has a little bit of that, and it just has all of my favorite roll under mechanics kind of in one place. I'm stealing some stuff from Into the Odd as well. Once I have enough rules that I think that it's basically playable, I'll probably put it up on my Patreon for all the $2 and plus people. They might want to take a look at it. I have so many like game ideas just like rolling around in my head at all times. I'm pretty lucky that I have a group of kids that I can test stuff on really easily. Got a big mountain here. Okay. So these mountains are looking pretty good. I like how this is looking. I don't know if we're going to have time to cover all of these. So I just want to get more of this side done. I think I'm going to move on to doing some rivers. I've actually been thinking about doing more and more in terms of color with stuff like this, but I don't have a lot of colored pens. Maybe doing it on like cardstock and then using watercolors, because watercolors are super easy and they look pretty good. But let's go with some rivers and then some forests. So with rivers, let's go with a really skinny one because you can get a lot of that detail in. Okay, so let's have some big rivers going through here. So this will be sort of like a big watershed. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. You can add lots of little twists and turns like this to make it look more, river-like. It can be really instructive to find like these maps of like all of the rivers in America or all the rivers in one particular country and really start getting a sense for the way that rivers move. I'm not perfect at it yet, but. And especially the way that like the shape of a river tells you exactly what the land underneath it looks like. because rivers are following the lowest points. So you can actually see what the terrain looks like by what the rivers in the area look like. And you don't have to have all your rivers going to mountains and hills. They can sort of, trickle off because they can come from little streams building up over time and things like that. And the amount of like tributaries that you put in there is going to help determine how big the thing actually looks, what your scale is. That's going to definitely affect it a lot. So we have so the land is sort of running down in this direction over here. And I assume it's going to kind of run down in this direction over here. Let's have it go all the way out to here. And then let's have some from this area going in to meet it. Because these waterways are also important for things like travel and communication. So where you put these is going to determine where a lot of your cities and landmarks are too. Okay, and let's have a little bit coming in from this direction as well. Let's have a bunch of small rivers just heading out to the sea over here. That's fairly common when you have like these mountain ranges close to the coast. There we go. It's kind of neat. And then a few rivers down here. And so on. But the main waterways are going to be up here. Okay. Let's go with forests before we start figuring out where our cities and stuff are going to be. Clyde says, you won't be very chatty because you're on your phone. No problem, Clyde. Glad to have you. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to type in any questions or comments you might have. All right. Forests. I want this place to be really foresty. I like deep, dark forests. Just because you can put a lot of things in them. And players are going to want to go through them. Let's just start over here. So let's see if I can do this right. There we go. You're just using the brush pen technique that I mentioned before, I think in a previous video. And you sort of dab it like that. So that you have it pointy at the top, fat at the bottom. And you can create some pretty realistic looking forests, especially conifer forests, really easily. You can even put them like on mountains and things like that, which is cool, or like kind of sticking out from behind mountains. That can be a really cool effect. I was so happy when I figured out that I could do this, because drawing little trees by hand is a really exhausting process. And this makes it so much faster. Makes it look pretty good too. Let's put some over here. It's a little bit out of focus on this camera. Hopefully you get the idea. The angle of the light is kind of washing them out. Let's see here. That's fine. And you can really easily control the spacing of the trees. You can control how dense the thing looks really easily with very little effort. One important thing to note is that if you have a civilization or an empire or whatever that is fairly well developed and built up, you're not going to have a lot of really dense forests around it. Maybe at its outskirts, sure. But by and large, human beings move into a territory and just cut everything down. That's not like a modern, environmentalist thing. That's just how humans survive. When I visited Iceland a long time ago, well, not a long time ago, like 5-6 years ago, Iceland has no trees on it. It's completely bare. It's kind of weird. And that didn't used to be like that. Like there used to be dense forest covering the entire island, basically. But the Vikings moved there, and like within a couple hundred years, there were no trees left in Iceland. They just razed the entire island, using it for building houses and burning it and things like that. And it's a huge problem because having all of these trees there actually like roots all of the soil in the ground and prevents erosion and does all of these other things for the environment. But it's not there, so there's tons of erosion in Iceland. Like the land is like falling off into the sea and falling off the sides of mountains. So they're trying to fix it by replanting, but the sheer scale of how many trees they have to plant to even begin reforesting Iceland is so massive that it's going to take hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years to really get it going again. It's crazy. Anyway, random tangent. Now, when you're doing little forests like this, if you don't have like a brush pen, what I did for a little while was just do lots of really pointy inverted V's, kind of like mountains, but much smaller and much pointier. And if you just do a whole bunch of those, you can actually create a pretty good forest effect too. But this is a lot faster, and I am all about efficiency. I've seen a lot of other mappers out there who have like these really beautiful looking but extremely painstaking process for drawing forests or whatever, and I'm really impressed by it, but dude, I don't have the patience for that most of the time. Let's just sort of fill all this in, like this whole gap in here with trees as well. Good. So when you're trying to figure out where your cities are going to be, they're going to be taking a lot of different things into account, right? So for example, it's not like where you're putting your cities. You got to think about where would cities grow, because cities are just where people would choose to settle, and they would always choose to settle somewhere for a reason, right? It's never arbitrary. So you got to think about why they would be there. And usually it's because it's at a crossroads, because you're going to get a lot of trade immediately happening if you're at a place where a lot of people have to come. So things like forks in a river or just on rivers in general are a big deal because everyone's going to use them. Those can provide you with water. Anywhere that's like near a pass that people have to go through is a big deal. And of course, having a lot of arable land. But transportation is a really big deal. It's rare to have a city just right in the middle of nowhere, right away from major roads and away from major rivers. That's just not how landscapes develop. It's not how kingdoms develop. So you got to think about what those people are thinking there when they put it there. So let's say that there's a lot of, let's move it over. Maybe we can get to focus a little bit better. Okay. I think near the margins of this camera, it gets a little fuzzy. That's fine. So I'm not sure how much detail you want to put here, but cities near the ends of rivers, I just use little squares for the most part, are prime places to put cities because they're going to be seaports. They're going to get all the traffic along the river, and they're going to get traffic from across the ocean. That's a huge deal. So same deal over here. I'm going to expect there's going to be one here. I'm going to create all of our port cities first. and one definitely here. This would be a big deal because not only would you get a lot of trade and water from all of these tributaries, which would give you access to the whole interior of this continent, but you can easily trade with any kingdoms or cities along this whole bay here. So that's going to give you a really important position. Not only that, but it's close to the mouth of this, which means that you're going to control access to it. So whatever city is going to be built here is going to have a really influential position. And who are they trading with, right? Let's put a couple things around the coast. So let's say that there's a river that's going to drain out into that area. There'd be one there. And put one on the island. It's always cool to have island cities. Okay, so those are your major ones. So think of this like Troy, right? The reason why Troy was such a big deal in the ancient world is because it guarded the entrance to the Black Sea. So that had a really powerful strategic position in terms of trade. So these are our big cities. Let's make them squares. Let's make our smaller ones circles, maybe. And they're mostly around rivers. Maybe one further up here. Maybe one that's near this mountain range, not exactly on a river, but it's maybe a mining town. And we can even have a couple going up this river like this, right? Because it makes sense that you would actually have a chain of cities. You wouldn't have them really spread out. If you're having a lot of transport going up and down the river, you're going to want places for them to stay. So it's going to make sense to set up towns and resting spots along the river to get as much traffic as they can. Also, in general, cities weren't really spread out, right? They mostly stayed close to each other. And that was because most people traveled by foot. There wasn't a lot of people traveling by horses if this was the medieval times. Most people would walk on foot because horses were expensive, which means that most cities had to be within a day's walk. Less than that, really, more like half a day's walk, because you have to be able to get there and get back if you're going to do any sort of trade with that city. All right, so people walk, 3 miles an hour? And let's say it takes them 4 or 5 hours to get there. So you have 10, 15 miles maximum in between cities, usually less than that, probably more like 10 miles. So think about that when you have spreading out cities everywhere in these huge kingdoms. They would mostly be in clusters. You would have a major metropolis. Then you'd have smaller cities nearby that could easily come and go to it. Like a fishing village over there. Either that or they're along rivers, which allows people to travel faster. So this will be like a separate political entity over here, just because it's cut off right there. There's going to be a lot of mountain towns, maybe near the mouths of these rivers that they can use. Maybe it's a dwarven kingdom. Got like a fishing village over here. And then if you want, you can set up actual footpaths. You set up the actual roads and the routes that people are using to get from one place to another. So over here in this town, people are this area, most people are going to be using the river to get from place to place, right? But you can put little dotted lines in between cities to show roads. So there's going to have to be definitely a trade route from here. There's no waterway. Unless you want to sail all the way around, it might actually be quicker just to walk, especially if you can't afford passage or something like that. So you might have a road heading through this pass. And if you have a road going in that direction, well, then you're going to have more cities probably spring up along it, probably in like 10-mile increments, unless the area is particularly barren or hazardous, because you're going to want to support that trade as much as possible. Same thing here, maybe we have a route going through the mountains around to this place. So you want to have a combination of what makes sense on a game level right? So that you offer a lot of interesting gamified things for players to deal with and to think about, while also trying to keep things realistic enough. Because when you have a reason for why everything is there, then players are going to be able to predict stuff, right? They're going to be able to make plans. Players are going to be able to look at a map and say, well, this city is here and this river is here, so probably this is the case. There's probably trade going in this direction, or I can probably get from here to here because other people probably did. So having a certain level of realism can allow for out-of-the-box thinking and really player-led campaigns. Whereas if everything is fairly arbitrary and just decided by the DM, then players aren't going to be able to predict stuff and make choices on their own because there's no real underlying logic for why things are there. And you want to give that to people. We're going from there to there. And then like once I have everything fleshed out, obviously I'm just sort of working on this part right now, but I really like adding those little waves right along the coast. And I usually do that in 2 steps. So like, let's get a little pen, like a size 3, there we go, and like a size 1. And just add little wavy bits, like so. And then you just leave little breaks in between them. So it's like little waves rushing up onto the shore. This also really helps differentiate where the land is and where the sea is. It makes that border thicker, so your eye picks it out more quickly. And by having the sea side have little waves on it, you don't get confused about which side is the land, which side is the sea. Because in some maps, that can actually be an issue, where if there's not enough detail, you can't immediately tell. All right, so you start off with something like that and then go with a much thinner one, like the one I was using for the roads. There it is. And then this is much thinner, and you sort of just create another layer. And you should have something like that. I find doing this really relaxing. Normally when I'm doing a lot of mapping, I'll just like put on some podcasts and just chew through a bunch of those. Back when I was doing a lot of making Warhammer figures for my games club, I went through, what was it? One of those sci-fi podcasts, Tanis, where it was like there was a conspiracy and everyone was trying to figure out what Tanis was. And it was like this Cthulhu-esque alternate universe, but it was all presented like an NPR news story. It was pretty cool. And I just went through a ton of that. It's a good thing to spend your time doing rather than just, you know, hanging out on the internet and just clicking through Twitter over and over, which I can get trapped in sometimes. Doing anything physical with your hands can make a really big deal in terms of just feeling better about yourself. So when you have a lot of like land masses close together, like these little islands, I don't try and squish these waves in between them. I just kind of go around. And ooh, let's get these little ones too. Doing this around the little islands also makes them easier to spot. It just highlights them so that it's clearer that, hey, look, there's an island here. Let's see. All right. Well, it's almost 8. So it's been about an hour. I think we're going to wrap up pretty soon. To finish up a bit of this. So some stuff I'm thinking about working on in the future on the channel. I got a couple of videos planned. I got a bunch of reviews I need to get done. Some really great books coming up. But also I'm planning to do some interviews. I'd like to get some more gaming legends on the channel to interview. I'm thinking about getting Tim Kask on. He's already agreed to come on at some point. I just need to figure out the best time to do that. And I'm also thinking about making some more general videos about sort of looking at a lot of the reviews I've done of particular books and putting them into categories. So, for example, doing a video that was like the 5 best D&D settings that you haven't heard of. I know it's a little clickbaity, not the thing I normally do, but it seems like a great way to get out there into the YouTube D&D space, which is growing really quickly, and just introduce them to a lot of OSR stuff. Because there's a lot of people getting into 5e. The hobby is growing so quickly, and a lot of people aren't aware of the really high quality content that the OSR is putting out that you could easily adapt for 5e. So doing stuff like that and just showing people, look, here's 5 amazing books. They're not made by Wizards of the Coast. You may not have heard of them, but they produce really great stuff that you can add to your campaign. Seems like a great way to just expand, this small fraction of a hobby that we're in. All right. That's looking pretty good. I really like where this is going. I like the potential that it has for a large campaign, just because there's a lot of tension between the different areas. There's a lot of obstacles from here and there. You're going to want to travel to these islands. You're going to want to cross the ocean. Lots of variety in terms of the types of encounters. It's kind of implied in the way that this is set up. At least I hope so. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks to all my patrons, all you guys for supporting me, hanging out with me. I really appreciate it. Always let me know if you have any questions, if you have anything that you would like me to cover, and I'll be happy to talk to you guys about it. I'll put links down in the description below for anyone who's watching this later, if you want to join me on Patreon as well. And thanks for watching, everybody. See you guys later.